The wind cuts through frozen trees like a blade through bone, each gust carrying ice crystals that sting exposed skin like thousands of tiny needles. An old radio crackles with static somewhere in the darkness, the only human sound for miles in any direction. Deep in the Canadian wilderness, where winter doesn't just arrive but conquers everything it touches, where temperatures drop so low that trees explode from frozen sap, a group of experienced hikers stumbles upon something that challenges everything they think they know about the natural world. Massive tracks in the snow, each one nearly 3 feet long, leading deeper into the white void that stretches endlessly in every direction. But something is immediately, terribly wrong with these prints. The blood pooling in and around them is dark, almost black, the color of old motor oil against the pristine white. The stride pattern shows stumbling, irregular spacing, drag marks where something heavy scraped between steps. This creature, whatever it is, isn't hunting with purpose and predatory grace. It's fleeing in desperation. They follow the trail for nearly 2 miles, their headlamps cutting weak cones of light through the falling snow. The tracks lead them down into a ravine where massive ice formations hang like frozen waterfalls, where the snow has been disturbed in chaotic patterns, where something large has tried desperately to hide itself from whatever hunts it. Labored breathing echoes off the ice-covered rocks, wet and ragged, the sound of lungs working too hard just to keep functioning. One of them raises a flashlight with a trembling hand, and there it is. A Wendigo. But not the creature from stories, not the unstoppable force of nature that legends describe. This thing is emaciated beyond belief, ribs visible through translucent gray skin that seems to glow faintly in the darkness. Its antlers are cracked and broken, several points snapped off completely. Its claws are shattered like brittle glass, leaving bloody stumps. Eyes that should burn with predatory hunger instead burn with fever, with pain, with something that looks disturbingly like fear. It doesn't lunge forward in attack. It recoils, pressing itself desperately against the frozen stone wall, trying to make itself smaller, trying to escape despite having nowhere left to run. And in that single moment, everything humanity has believed about monsters becomes a lie we told ourselves to feel safer in the dark. It's easy to fear the Wendigo, to make it the villain of our nightmares, until the moment you realize it was fearing something far, far worse than anything we could imagine. The Wendigo. A name that has frozen blood in veins for centuries. A legend whispered around winter campfires by people who know the true cost of survival in the frozen north. According to popular culture, according to the stories that Hollywood and horror novels have told us for decades, it's a spirit of insatiable hunger, a creature born from the ultimate taboo of cannibalism and greed, the monster of eternal winter that can never be satisfied no matter how much it consumes. The Algonquin people spoke of it with reverence and terror in equal measure, a cautionary tale about the dangers of excess, selfishness, and destructive consumption in environments where cooperation and moderation mean the difference between survival and death. To become a Wendigo was to lose your humanity entirely, to transform into an insatiable beast that could never be satisfied, always hungry, always hunting, growing larger with each victim it consumed until it towered over the trees themselves. The transformation was said to happen to those who resorted to cannibalism during harsh winters, but also to those consumed by greed, by the kind of selfishness that would let others starve while hoarding resources. The Wendigo represented everything a community needed to guard against to survive the brutal winters where the Algonquin peoples made their homes. But here's what the popular stories don't tell you. Here's what got lost in translation, buried under decades of Hollywood horror and campfire mythology designed to frighten children into good behavior. There are older accounts that were never widely published, never made it into the mainstream understanding of the legend. Accounts that describe something completely different, something terrifying in an entirely new way that makes the traditional story look almost comforting by comparison. In 1873, a colonial surveyor named Edmund Blackwood wrote in his personal journal, an entry that his descendants only made public in 2015. He wrote, "I saw the creature they call Wendigo running through the trees as if pursued by hellfire itself, crashing through branches without regard for the noise it made. It looked back over its shoulder with what I can only describe as human terror, the kind of expression I have seen on men's faces in battle when they know death is coming for them and there is no escape. In 1921, an indigenous elder named Thomas Whitebear shared a story with an anthropologist who was documenting oral traditions. The anthropologist's notes were considered too controversial to publish at the time and remained in university archives until they were digitized decades later. The Wendigo, Whitebear said, fears the white call. When the white call awakens from its deep sleep, even the spirits of hunger must hide like children afraid of their father's anger. The Wendigo is not the end. It is the beginning of something much worse. A researcher named Dr. Sarah Chen in 1986 compiled a comprehensive map of documented Wendigo encounters across 3 centuries, pulling from indigenous accounts, colonial records, newspaper archives, and first-hand testimonies. She noticed something that every other researcher had somehow missed or chosen to ignore. Every single aggressive encounter, every attack, every sighting of the creature happened within 2 weeks, sometimes just days, of a catastrophic event in the same region. Avalanches that buried entire mining camps under tons of snow and ice. Mass disappearances in isolated towns where every resident simply vanished overnight, leaving meals half-eaten and fires still burning. Structural collapses of buildings that defied engineering explanation, as if something had deliberately undermined their foundations. Bridge failures that killed dozens. Mine shafts that suddenly flooded despite being above the water table. The pattern was undeniable once you knew to look for it, and yet it had been completely ignored by mainstream folklore research. Dr. Chen tried to publish her findings, but every academic journal rejected the paper, calling it correlation without causation, seeing patterns where none existed. She died in 1993, and her research was largely forgotten until recently when digital archives made it accessible again. The legends were incomplete, you see. Dangerously incomplete. The Wendigo wasn't just a predator at the top of the supernatural food chain. It was prey. And what hunted it was something we'd been too afraid to acknowledge, too terrified to name, too small in our understanding to even conceive of properly. Back in the ravine, the present moment crystallizes into something unthinkable, something that will haunt every person there for the rest of their lives. The Wendigo is trying to speak. Its jaw, elongated and inhuman, covered in frozen saliva and blood, struggles to form shapes that might be words, that might carry meaning beyond animal sounds. The muscles in its throat work visibly beneath the translucent skin, tendons standing out like cables under tension. The sound that emerges is tortured, broken, like someone trying to speak through a throat full of broken glass, but it's undeniably purposeful. Not random animal noises, not the mindless growling of a beast, but deliberate attempts at communication, at making these humans understand something desperately important. The group freezes in a tableau of terror and confusion. One of them, a young man named Marcus who'd been documenting the entire expedition, fumbles for his phone with hands shaking so badly he nearly drops it in the snow. He manages to start recording, capturing this impossible moment on video. Another hiker, a woman named Sarah Chen, yes, the researcher's granddaughter who joined this expedition partly because of her grandmother's research, backs away slowly, muttering prayers in 3 different languages, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Then the ground trembles beneath their feet. It's subtle at first, barely perceptible, like the idle vibration of a distant engine, but it grows steadily stronger with each passing second. From somewhere deep in the forest, from a direction that seems to shift even as they try to pinpoint it, something releases a sound that shouldn't exist in nature, that shouldn't be possible for any living thing to produce. Deep, guttural, resonant, it's a sound that vibrates in your chest cavity and makes your teeth ache, that seems to bypass your ears entirely and speak directly to the most primitive part of your brain, the part that knows when you're prey and something much larger has noticed you. It's the sound of something vast and ancient and hungry beyond any hunger they can comprehend. The Wendigo's reaction is instantaneous and heartbreaking in its raw terror. It whimpers, a high-pitched sound of pure fear that seems completely wrong coming from a creature of legend, from a monster that's supposed to be the apex predator of winter itself. A creature from nightmares makes the sound of a terrified animal caught in a trap, knowing the hunter is coming. It looks toward the source of that terrible echo, its fever-bright eyes wide with panic, and then it does something that changes everything these people thought they understood about the nature of monsters and humanity. It points with one broken, bloodied claw. The gesture is clumsy but unmistakable, almost human in its desperation, the shattered claw extending toward the dark forest behind them. The message is absolutely clear despite the lack of words. Run. Leave this place. Something is coming, and if you value your lives and your souls, you will flee now while you still can. In 1891, a Catholic priest named Father Michael O'Brien, who'd been sent to document indigenous oral histories and convert the peoples he encountered, wrote an entry in his journal that would be his last. He wrote, "The creature with exposed bones and hollow eyes that they fear so greatly is not the evil they believe it to be. It is the warning. It is the alarm bell that rings before the true catastrophe arrives. We have mistaken the messenger for the message, and God forgive us for our blindness." They found his journal 20 years later in an abandoned chapel deep in the wilderness, the building somehow preserved despite decades of harsh weather. The last page of his journal had been torn out, leaving only ragged edges. The local people said Father O'Brien had walked into the forest one winter night and never returned. They said they could still hear him screaming sometimes when the wind blew from the north. For over a century, researchers, folklorists, and storytellers attributed Wendigo attacks to the creature itself, building an entire mythology around it as the ultimate predator. But if you look at the historical evidence closely, really closely, with an open mind and without preconceptions, there's always something else present. Something the witnesses mentioned but investigators dismissed. Unusual weather patterns in the days before encounters, temperature drops that broke all previous records, storms that seemed to form from nothing and disappear just as quickly. Seismic activity that doesn't match regional geology, tremors in areas that should be tectonically stable. Animal migrations moving in the wrong direction, entire herds of caribou running south when they should be going north, wolves abandoning their territories, birds falling silent days before incidents. And in 3 separate incidents spanning nearly 100 years, survivors mentioned a second presence, something they glimpsed in their peripheral vision, something that made the Wendigo seem like a child in comparison. Those accounts were dismissed as trauma-induced hallucinations, the mind creating additional threats to explain the terror they'd experienced. But what if they weren't hallucinating? What if they saw exactly what was there? Against every survival instinct screaming at them to flee, against everything their rational minds tell them is the right choice, the group makes a decision that will haunt them forever, that will fundamentally alter the course of their lives. They decide to help the Wendigo, to try to save the monster that's supposed to be their enemy. Using torn strips of clothing, climbing rope from their packs, even removing their own jackets despite the deadly cold, they fashion a crude harness around the creature's emaciated torso. It takes nearly 30 minutes of careful work, and the Wendigo doesn't resist at any point. If anything, it seems confused by their kindness, its fever-bright eyes tracking their movements with something that might be gratitude or might be pity for their ignorance of what's coming. They drag it through the deepening snow for 2 miles, taking turns at the front of the makeshift sled they've created, their muscles burning with effort. The creature is surprisingly light for its size, as if its bones are hollow like a bird's, as if whatever transformation created it burned away everything unnecessary for its purpose. They reach an abandoned ranger station that hasn't seen human occupation in 15 years, a structure slowly being reclaimed by the forest, its windows broken and door hanging from one hinge. Inside, they start a fire in the old wood stove, surprised when it still works. The Wendigo huddles near the warmth but not too close, as if even this small comfort is something it doesn't deserve, something it's no longer entitled to after what it's become. And that's when the real investigation begins, when Sarah Chen's anthropological training kicks in and she starts trying to make sense of the impossible. She's a folklore graduate student working on her dissertation about the evolution of Native American legends in modern contexts. She starts asking questions, not expecting answers but needing to process what's happening, needing to apply her academic training to something that defies all academic understanding. The Wendigo responds in ways that shouldn't be possible for a mindless monster. Not with words, not yet, but with desperate, intentional communication. It scratches symbols into the wooden floor with its broken claws, the sound like nails on a chalkboard, making everyone's teeth hurt. The symbols are crude but deliberate, repeated with variations when they don't understand, refined and simplified like someone trying to communicate across a language barrier. When they misunderstand, when they guess wrong about what it's trying to convey, it slams its head against the wall in frustration, a disturbingly human gesture of exasperation that makes them all flinch. It's the kind of thing a person does when words fail them, when they can't make themselves understood and the stakes are desperately high. After more than an hour of failed attempts, of misinterpretations and corrections, it finally creates an image they can understand, a pictogram simple enough to transcend language. A crude drawing scratched into the old wooden planks. First, a human figure, stick figure simple but unmistakable. An arrow. Then a Wendigo, more detailed, showing the antlers and elongated limbs. Another arrow. Then something much, much larger, a shape that takes up 3 times the space, with details that hurt to look at even in simple scratches on wood. A progression. A sequence. A transformation and what comes after. A warning. Sarah remembers something from her research, a fragment of Algonquin tradition that her grandmother had mentioned in her notes, something that was never widely shared outside certain families, considered too sacred or too dangerous for outside documentation. The White Hunger, her grandmother had called it in her private notes, though that was probably a translation that didn't capture the full meaning. An entity that predates the Wendigo legend by centuries, maybe millennia. According to the fragmentary accounts her grandmother had collected from elders who were now long dead, it awakens only under specific conditions, when human suffering and environmental catastrophe reach a critical threshold, when mortality and despair create a kind of spiritual gravity well that pulls it from wherever it sleeps. When communities break down completely, when people turn on each other, when the balance between humanity and nature tips too far in the wrong direction, when greed and selfishness reach levels that poison the very land itself. That's when the White Hunger wakes, drawn to suffering like a shark to blood in the water. The Wendigo wasn't the curse, Sarah realizes with growing horror. It was the first stage, the initial response to the conditions that might wake the White Hunger. A defense mechanism, as her grandmother had theorized but never proven. A sacrifice chosen by forces beyond human comprehension, transformed against their will to serve a purpose they might not even understand. And here's where it gets truly disturbing, where the horrifying implications become impossible to ignore. The Wendigo isn't looking at them like a wounded animal looks at potential threats, isn't watching them with the wariness of prey surrounded by predators. It's looking at them with recognition, with familiarity, with emotions that shouldn't exist in a monster. Specifically, it keeps staring at one of them, a quiet man in his 40s named David who's been quieter than the others throughout the entire ordeal, who's been standing back and watching with an expression that's hard to read. The way the Wendigo stares at him is knowing, intimate, heartbroken in a way that transcends species or form. And then they all understand at once, the realization hitting like a physical blow. This Wendigo was human once. Not in the distant past, not centuries ago when the legends began. Recently. Maybe months ago, maybe only weeks. And it remembers being human. It remembers its life before, its identity, the people it loved. It remembers what it lost when the transformation took it. And it knows exactly what's coming for them all, what's been hunting it through these frozen woods, what will arrive soon and bring an end to everything. David starts to cry, silent tears freezing on his cheeks, and the Wendigo makes a sound that might be his name. The ranger station shakes like it's caught in an earthquake, but there's no seismic activity ever reported in this region, no fault lines, no geological explanation for the violent tremors that rattle the old structure to its foundations. The windows frost over in patterns that look almost like reaching fingers, like something outside is pressing against the glass, leaving impressions of hands that have too many joints. That deep, guttural sound returns, the one that bypasses hearing and speaks directly to the animal brain, but it's closer now, so much closer they can feel it in their bones, in their teeth, in the chambers of their hearts. The temperature inside the station drops 30 degrees in under a minute, their breath becoming visible in thick clouds, ice forming on every surface despite the fire still burning in the stove. The Wendigo lurches to its feet with a cry of pain and terror, panic overriding its injuries, its broken body moving with desperate speed. The group moves instinctively toward the door, ready to run into the night, to take their chances in the forest rather than wait here for whatever approaches. But the creature blocks their path with surprising speed, putting itself between them and the exit. Not aggressively, not with the threatening posture of a predator cutting off prey. Pleadingly, desperately, like someone trying to protect people they care about from making a fatal mistake. It points to itself with one shattered claw, then to the direction of the approaching presence that's making the whole building shake, then down to the floor at its feet. The gesture is repeated 3 times, each one more desperate than the last, each one making the meaning crystal clear even without words. Sarah understands first, her anthropological knowledge and her grandmother's research clicking together into a horrifying picture. Her voice cracks as she explains, words tumbling out in a rush. The only way to delay the white hunger, the only way to prevent it from fully awakening and manifesting in this world, is to sacrifice the Wendigo willingly. To complete the transformation that was started, to give its essence back to the frozen earth, to close the cycle that was meant to hold back something worse. The Wendigo was never meant to live long. It was meant to be a temporary guardian, a sacrifice that would buy time, that would hold back the greater darkness until the conditions that summoned it could change. By helping it, by keeping it alive, they've interfered with a process that's much older than human civilization. The Wendigo kneels slowly, each movement clearly agonizing, its broken legs folding beneath it. A monster from legend, a creature that should be hunting them, kneeling like a penitent in church, offering itself with a dignity that seems impossible for something that should be mindless and hungry. David steps forward, his face wet with tears that freeze almost instantly in the supernaturally cold air. He's shaking so badly he can barely stand, but he forces himself to move closer. He speaks, and his voice is barely a whisper, choked with grief. "I know you. I know who you are." The Wendigo nods, a distinctly human gesture of acknowledgement, and the confirmation breaks something in David. He falls to his knees in the snow that somehow started falling inside the station, huge flakes that materialize from nothing. The creature reaches up with one broken claw, moving with careful slowness, and touches its own chest where something metallic glints between the exposed ribs. A medallion, tarnished and old, hanging on a chain that somehow survived the transformation. David pulls an identical one from under his shirt with trembling hands. They're matching, clearly a pair, the kind of thing family members share. "Tommy," David says, his voice breaking completely. "Tommy, I looked for you for 6 months. They said you got lost in the storm, they said there was no way anyone could survive that blizzard. I never stopped looking. I never gave up." Brothers. The Wendigo was David's younger brother Thomas, who disappeared during a freak blizzard the previous winter, who was leading a group of stranded travelers to safety when the storm hit, who stayed behind to make sure everyone else got out while he faced the worst of it alone. David starts to refuse the implicit request, starts to say there has to be another way, that he can't do this, he won't do this, he just got his brother back and he can't lose him again. But Thomas, the thing that used to be Thomas, touches his face with surprising gentleness despite the broken claws, and David sees recognition in those fever-bright eyes, sees his little brother still in there somewhere. Then Thomas does something he hasn't done since his transformation, something that shouldn't be possible with his altered vocal cords and elongated jaw. He speaks actual words, not gestures or drawings or desperate sounds, but real human speech. The voice is ruined, barely recognizable, like someone speaking through a throat full of broken glass and ice, but the words are clear enough, the meaning unmistakable. Not for me. For them. For everyone. It has to be willing. It has to be family. That's how it works. That's how we stop it. The white hunger is pressing against reality itself now, trying to force its way through from wherever it sleeps, drawn by the suffering and terror that's been building. The walls of the ranger station groan and crack, wood that stood for decades splintering like it's made of paper. Ice forms in impossible patterns, defying gravity, growing upward from the floor in crystalline spikes. The temperature drops so fast that their breath freezes before it leaves their mouths, forming tiny ice crystals that fall like snow. Outside, through the frosted windows, they can see trees bending without wind, the forest itself warping as something massive moves between the trunks, something that doesn't quite fit properly into three-dimensional space, something that makes their eyes hurt and their minds scream to look away. There's no time left for debate, no time for alternatives, no time for anything but the choice that's been presented to them. Sarah finds an old axe in the station supply closet, the blade rusty but still sharp enough for what needs to be done. Her hands shake as she brings it to David, understanding that this is his burden to bear, his choice to make, his sacrifice to complete. The Wendigo, Thomas, positions itself carefully, tilting its head back to expose the vulnerable line of its throat where gray skin stretches thin over tendons and bone. It whispers something that might be, "Thank you," or might be, "I'm sorry," or might be, "I love you." The words are unclear, but the meaning transcends language. David takes the axe, his hands shaking so violently he can barely maintain his grip on the wooden handle. Tears stream down his face, freezing in tracks on his cheeks. He whispers his own words, a litany of apologies and love and goodbye, telling his brother all the things he never got to say after the disappearance. Thomas nods once, giving permission, giving absolution, and David swings with all his strength, not wanting to prolong this, not wanting his brother to suffer any more than he already has. The blow is clean, merciful, the axe blade passing through with surprising ease as if the transformation had made the flesh less substantial, more spirit than matter. The Wendigo's body collapses, and as it does, something impossible happens that they'll never be able to explain to anyone who wasn't there. For just a moment, less than a heartbeat but feeling like an eternity, the creature's form flickers like a badly tuned television. And underneath the monster, they see the man. Thomas as he was before the transformation, young and healthy and whole, maybe 28 years old, smiling with pure relief that the burden is finally over, that he's finally free. Then the image is gone, and there's only the body, already beginning to dissolve into snow and ice, returning to the elements it came from. But in that final second before the transformation completes, the human form speaks one last word with perfect clarity, with urgency that cuts through everything else. Run. The door doesn't just open, it explodes inward, the hinges ripping from the frame, wood and metal flying across the room. What enters isn't something that can be easily described in human language, isn't something the human mind is equipped to fully process or comprehend. It's massive, yes, but mass doesn't begin to cover what they're seeing. It seems to exist in more dimensions than the three they can perceive, parts of it visible while other parts fold into spaces that shouldn't exist, that make their eyes water and their heads ache just to look at. The white hunger has arrived, drawn by the sacrifice, by the death of the thing that was meant to hold it back. This is what the Wendigo was created to delay, what all the transformations and sacrifices throughout history were meant to prevent from fully manifesting in the physical world. But something has changed, something crucial that might save them all. The sacrifice has affected it in ways they don't fully understand. Instead of the devastating, world-ending awakening that should have occurred, it hesitates at the threshold. The willing sacrifice, the completion of the cycle by family blood, has weakened it somehow, confused it, trapped it partially between worlds. It's still dangerous, still terrible, still capable of destroying everything for miles around, but it's not at full power. Not yet. Not quite fully awake. The sacrifice bought them time, bought them a chance, bought them the possibility of escape. They run without discussion, without plan, pure survival instinct taking over. Through the destroyed door, into the forest where the snow falls upward and trees bend in impossible directions. Behind them, the forest itself vibrates like the whole world is breathing, like reality is struggling to contain what they've unleashed. They don't stop until they reach their vehicles miles away, their lungs burning, their legs threatening to give out. They don't look back, because looking back might mean seeing something their minds can't survive seeing. And in the distance, they can hear the forest screaming. The official report, filed with local authorities 3 days after they emerge from the wilderness, calls it a shared psychotic episode brought on by environmental factors. Altitude sickness combined with hypothermia-induced hallucinations, the attending physician writes in his notes. Stress and isolation leading to group delusion, a well-documented phenomenon in extreme conditions. The group is treated for minor frostbite on fingers and toes, given antibiotics as a precaution, and released with recommendations for psychiatric evaluation and follow-up care. The authorities are sympathetic but clearly don't believe a word of their story. Marcus's video footage is dismissed as corrupted and inconclusive, just shadows and snow, nothing that proves anything supernatural occurred. But 3 days after they file their report, an avalanche hits a popular ski resort 30 miles from the ranger station, despite perfect weather conditions and no geological triggers. No warnings, no precipitating events, just sudden catastrophic snow displacement. 17 people are reported missing, buried under tons of snow. Rescue teams find no bodies, just empty spaces in the snow where people should be. 5 days after that, an entire mining crew in the same region simply vanishes during a routine shift change. 143 people. Their equipment is found still running, computers logged in, lunch still warm on break room tables, coffee still steaming in mugs. But every single person is gone without a trace, without signs of struggle, without any indication of where they went or how. The disappearances continue, small at first, isolated incidents that might be coincidence. A family camping trip where the tent is found but the family isn't. A group of snowmobilers who radio in their position and then are never heard from again. Each incident within a 100-mile radius of that ranger station, each one unexplained and impossible. Sarah goes back to her grandmother's research with new urgency, reading through decades-old notes with fresh understanding. She finds a line she missed the first time, written in the margin of a page about the white hunger, her grandmother's handwriting shaky as if the words themselves were dangerous to write down. When the warning dies before its time, when the sacrifice is made incomplete or too late, the hunger wakes slowly, feeding in pieces until it gathers enough strength to consume the whole. Each death feeds it. Each disappearance makes it stronger. And once it's fully awake, nothing can send it back to sleep. The warning. That's what the Wendigo was, what Thomas became, what all the transformed people throughout history were meant to be. Not monsters to be feared and destroyed, but warnings to be heeded, alarms that rang before the true catastrophe arrived. And humanity, in its ignorance and fear, had been killing the warnings and wondering why the disasters kept getting worse. They hadn't killed a monster. They'd killed the only thing that knew how to hold back something infinitely worse, the only defense against a hunger that could never be satisfied. And in doing so, even with the best intentions, even with love and mercy, they'd started a countdown to something terrible. David returns to the forest alone 2 weeks later, unable to stay away, needing to see the place where his brother died for the second and final time. He finds the ranger station collapsed under impossible amounts of ice, the structure completely buried despite the relatively mild weather since the incident. The ice is wrong somehow, the wrong color, the wrong texture, like it came from somewhere else and just appeared here. And carved into the trees around the station, in symbols that match exactly what Thomas had scratched into the floor, in patterns that couldn't have been made by natural processes or human tools, is a message. The same words repeated over and over on dozens of trees in a perfect circle around the buried station. Too late. Too late. Too late. David falls to his knees in the snow and screams his brother's name until his voice gives out, but the forest doesn't answer. It just watches with the patience of something that knows it's already won. 3 years pass like a wound that won't heal, time moving forward but the trauma remaining fresh and immediate. The group has scattered across the country, unable to stay in contact, unable to face what they'd been part of, unable to share their experience with anyone who wasn't there. Some have tried therapy, but how do you explain something like this to someone trained in rational explanations? The disappearances in the region continue sporadically, never quite enough to make national news, always with just plausible enough explanations to avoid widespread panic. Official investigations find nothing. Life goes on. The world keeps turning. And something in the Canadian wilderness continues to wake, one piece at a time. But then a researcher specializing in digital folklore recovery, a woman named Dr. Lisa Park, who makes her career finding and restoring lost media from disasters and forgotten storage servers, finds something that changes everything. A corrupted video file uploaded to a cloud server from that exact region, from that exact date, buried in automated backups that were never deleted. She manages to restore it over 3 weeks of painstaking work, reconstructing data bit by bit from fragments that should have been unrecoverable. The footage is shaky and dark and mostly unusable, exactly what you'd expect from a phone dropped in the snow during a moment of panic. Most of it is just white noise and static and brief flashes of movement too quick to identify. But in the final 10 seconds of the file, before the camera falls and the recording ends, there's a clear image that makes Dr. Park sit in silence for a full hour after she sees it for the first time. The Wendigo, looking directly into the lens with impossible awareness, knowing it's being recorded, knowing that someday someone might see this and understand. And for just one frame, less than a second of footage but feeling like an eternity when you pause and stare at it, the monster's face flickers and changes. What looks back at the camera is completely, heartbreakingly human. A young man, maybe 28 years old, with David's eyes and David's smile. Exhausted beyond measure. Sad in a way that transcends normal human sadness. Aware of everything that's happening and everything that's going to happen. Carrying the weight of a transformation he never asked for and a burden he can never put down. Mouthing words that the camera can't hear but that anyone with basic lip-reading skills can understand. 3 words, repeated twice for emphasis. Help us. Help us. Us. Plural. Not just Thomas. Not just one Wendigo. Multiple transformations, multiple sacrifices, multiple people chosen or cursed or transformed into warnings that no one heeds, scattered across the northern wilderness, all trying to hold back the same ancient hunger, all alone and terrified and knowing they'll eventually fail. The footage cuts to black abruptly, the file ending at the moment of impact. Dr. Park sits in her university office, the only light coming from her computer screen, and realizes she's holding evidence of something that should be impossible but is somehow real. She starts digging deeper, using her skills and access to archives that most people don't even know exist. Finding patterns in missing person cases going back decades, going back centuries. Finding evidence that this has happened before, again and again throughout history, in different places and different times but always following the same pattern. People disappear during times of extreme hardship. They reappear changed, transformed, barely recognizable. They're hunted or killed or destroyed by people who think they're monsters. And then disasters follow, catastrophes that kill dozens or hundreds or thousands, events that seem natural but have details that don't quite make sense when you look closely. The legend lies, she types into her research notes at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, unable to stop thinking about what she's discovered. Winter doesn't devour men. It transforms them into something else, something that serves a purpose we don't understand and probably can't understand. It chooses them or they choose it or something else chooses for them. And what they become isn't the monster we should fear. It's the only thing standing between us and something far worse, something that's been waiting in the dark places of the world since long before humans walked upright. The Wendigos are the guardians, the warnings, the sacrifices. And we've been killing them for centuries, mistaking salvation for damnation. Somewhere in the Canadian wilderness, in places where winter never truly ends, where the temperature drops below human survival and the trees crack like gunshots in the night, there are Wendigos still hiding, still running from what hunts them, still trying to hold back the white hunger. Still hoping that someone, anyone, will understand what they are before it's too late. Still praying that their sacrifice, their transformation, their suffering will matter in the end. Still mouthing the same words into the darkness. Help us. Help us. The wind cuts through frozen trees. An old radio crackles with static, the only human sound for miles. And deep in the white void, something ancient and patient and infinitely hungry continues to wake, feeding on each disappearance, growing stronger with each death, gathering itself piece by piece. The warnings are still out there, transformed humans trying desperately to hold back the inevitable. But fewer now than before. Weaker. More desperate. And the white hunger grows stronger every winter. One day, perhaps soon, the last warning will fall. The last Wendigo will die or be killed by people who think they're destroying evil. And on that day, the white hunger will wake fully, completely, unstoppably. And then we'll finally understand what the Wendigos were trying to tell us all along. That some monsters aren't meant to be defeated. They're meant to be listened to. But by then, it will be far too late.